All good, yeah? Great. Good evening, or good afternoon, in between, whatever. Long day at DanceFair, so thank you for joining me right at the end here. And yeah, great to see you all. Good to see some familiar faces, as always. DanceFair never ceases to amaze me every single year. So my name's Paul Nolan, as you can probably tell from the signs. And I'm a producer, composer, artist, developer, general audio geek, English idiot, whatever you want to call me. And today what I'm going to go through is a demo stage unreleased track. Okay. Now I'm doing this in a couple of different ways to what I would normally be known for doing. And number one is the fact that I'm doing this in Logic Pro. I'm normally known as an Ableton guy. If you follow my other masterclasses over the years in DanceFair and everywhere else, ADE, on YouTube, the stuff I do for Beatport as well, it's all Ableton Live. So I thought this year I'd switch it up and I would look at Logic in both of my masterclasses. So tomorrow I'm going to do a masterclass based on how to finish a track. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this 16-bar loop as it is, and basically I'm going to undergo my own 1-hour challenge, if you will, and I'm going to arrange this track in 1 hour. So essentially get it done in 1 hour, because one of the things that I'm known for is my workflow sort of tips and secrets that allow you to finish more music very, very quickly. And that's mostly been talked about in Ableton. But what I'm going to start showing you is that similar techniques with a slight twist are equally as applicable to Logic as they are to Ableton. And in fact, you could apply those same principles to everything. But I want to just define this genre that I'm writing in at the moment. And it is, as it was put on the sign here, it's known by many things: desert house, plier tech, if you've ever been to Burning Man. Some of my friends quite comedically call it vegan house, which I'm not quite sure about, but there you go. I thought that'd get a bit of a bigger laugh, but hey-ho. Yeah, so basically it's in the style of labels including All Day I Dream, Soul Selectors, that type of thing. Artists including Hraach, Bedouin, obviously, Lost Desert, people like this, where there's an organicness to it. It's obviously very emotional. It's quite interesting. So what I'm going to do is, rather than just play a reference track, I'm actually going to just play the loop to you, and then I'm going to break this down section by section, because it's quite a different sound to what people sort of know me for, more of a progressive house or a techno kind of guy. But I want to sort of showcase certain techniques, and also we're going to add to it in some ways as well during this masterclass. We're going to look at it from actually using some real instrumentation as well, and actually do some live recording as well. So I'll play you this, and then we'll break it down from there. So yeah, as you can hear, it's a little bit more, emotional, a little bit more stripped back, and a little bit more organic sounding than things that I'm normally known for. So let's just break it down in terms of, what's going on here, because this genre particularly has some kind of special rules attached to it, because it is referencing a lot from Middle Eastern music, and also, you know, a lot of Asian kind of musical cultures, you have to take that into consideration. So things like the scales that we use, the tunes that we use are slightly different. So that's something that we'll talk about as we kind of go through as well. But first of all, the entire sort of sound choice is very different. So say, for example, if we start with just the drums and we really, you know, break this down, you know, you can see there's, you know, the vast majority of this session is essentially drum sounds, and there's a lot of like layering going on. So let's just listen to the drums, and then we'll sort of split it down. So, you know, nice sort of groove, but again, the entirety almost of these drum sounds are pretty organic in texture rather than being electronic and a bit more synthetic. The great exception to that rule is the kick, which is, you know, your standard sort of big electronic kick. This is actually a kick that I kind of stumbled across in a deadmau5 sample pack. Which I just love. I think it's a great sounding kick. And again, you know, we could have a big conversation about like kick sound design and everything else and building them from scratch. But my sort of major belief is that if you can get it done in one kick, then just get it done in one kick. And also, shamelessly, use the same kick in as many different tracks as you need to. Like, because as we said during the techno talks just now, nobody gives a shit. Like, you know, don't feel like especially if you're a new producer, if you find a kick that you really like, that's really working in a track, keep using it. Use it as often as possible. Sebastian Ledger, who is a big mover in this kind of scene, if you haven't checked out his recent EPs on All Day I Dream, Lee Burridge's label, check them out. They're absolutely phenomenally good. And it was funny because I was DJing with Sebastian in Bali in September, and we were talking about production, and he basically told me that he basically used one kick drum his whole career, and he's been producing for 20 years. Yeah, so like again, like nobody really cares that much as long as the rest of the track's good and the kick works. That's great. Although he did say he sampled that kick from another record, so you know, highly ironic, right? So again, now I've got a kick that works for me. What you'll see here is actually very, very little in the way of processing, okay? I'm not compressing the kick, and again, this is a thing that I talk about on my online courses that I run through my company, Make Your Transition, NYT, where a lot of these samples and most of these sample packs that you get these days, they're already mastered. So why do you need to compress something again that's already been limited and normalized to 0 dBFS? You don't. You just find the right sound and you deploy it in the right way. Maybe the only thing you need to do is EQ it a little bit. But all you'll see here on my channel EQ is just a little shave off at 20. And if you listen to the kick on its own, it's totally fine. Like, you know, don't make it more complicated than it needs to be. The only other plugin I've got on here is actually another EQ, which is just a very simple single band EQ. And all that's going to do is, that's all that's going to do. So again, keeping it very, very simple. And the major takeaway from this masterclass will be, it's about sound selection more than anything. And the vast majority of like the few hours I've taken to put this track together, including some vocal work that we're going to talk about as well, has been on the sound selection. So these raw materials fit very, very well together straight out of the box. Like, this didn't happen by accident. This is being very clear on what I'm trying to create and finding the very, very best raw materials that I can find that work well together. That's it. So what you'll notice as well, there's very little in the way of tuning going on because I've deliberately picked the sounds to even work in tune with one another. Because again, I'm working in a slightly different way. If you've seen any of my other Ableton masterclasses, you'll know that I'm a big lover of the drum rack and, you know, MIDI processing and MIDI sequencing drums. And in fact, in Logic, I tend to work slightly differently because the tools are different. and I'll actually effectively work in audio most of the time with drum sounds. So I'm going to cover that in terms of a proper workflow tomorrow during my arrangement masterclass, because a lot of people give Logic a little bit of an unfair reputation, I think, especially in the face of how quick and how instant Ableton is these days, and that's fantastic, that's great. But once you know your way around Logic a little bit more, what Logic does, just to explain, is that it doesn't necessarily tell you everything it can do. There's a lot under the hood that most people don't know it can do. So I'll give you an example. If I was to hit Option and K here, what you can see now, this is literally the repository, the central place of all the key commands in Logic, every single one of them. And it's quite a long list. Now, the thing is, you'll notice there's quite a lot of them that don't have any form of key command next to them, because it's down to you to assign them. Where, say, for example, in other DAWs like Ableton and Pro Tools, for example, you have to learn the key commands that they give you. Logic is very different. Logic will work the way that you want it to. And essentially, I've had very funny times where I've watched people try to use my Logic in my studio on my main computer, and they're like, what? Because I've customized the key commands so much in the 10 years that I've been, or 10 years plus that I've been using Logic, that it's just almost like a special kind of code that only I know. But it's a fantastic thing. And again, there's a lot under the hood here that Logic is not telling you that it can do. And how you can get over that is, let's say, for example, you want to learn how to, automate better in Logic and what options are available. In the search bar there, just type in automate or automation. And then these are all the automation keyboard commands. And you'll learn things that you never knew Logic could do that, quite frankly, no other DAW can do. It's very, very interesting. So again, we're going to touch on that a little bit more tomorrow, but again, Logic has this reputation, and I think it's a very unfair one, and it's actually a very, very efficient DAW once you know how to use it. So the main thing I'm doing with the drums here is I'm passing it through Logic's own compressor, which actually, be honest, I'm a very big fan of, especially with what they've done in recent versions of Logic, where they've changed the user interface. Now, it's always been able to emulate certain types of circuitry and compression schemes, like VCA, opto compression, things like that. But they've done such a good job now of really, really pushing that to another level, both visually and also in terms of the sound. So if I was to play the drums to you, this is the only real sort of bit of proper processing that I'm doing. If you listen to the drums now, now you just hear everything just drop and not get quite as present and quite as shiny and quite as weighty. It's because of this. There is a distortion circuit that I'm a big, big fan of. And what you'll notice as well, the other detail, you notice there's absolutely no compression going on at all. I'm literally using it just for the soft distortion. So again, if I play that without and then turn it back in onto the soft, just everything comes to life. It's a beautiful thing. So again, that tends to be my go-to sort of bus processor. And yeah, if things start to get really hectic, but again, you've got to think about the genre here as well. The genre is all about dynamics and space and organic, very rich textures that can all express themselves. So you don't want to be, smashing 10 dB of gain reduction here, because that's just going to, completely overcook everything. You're trying to bring the subtle details out, which this little bit of distortion, soft clip distortion definitely does on the channel compressor. So we've spoken about the kick, and again, we'll move on here into the clap is quite an interesting one. This is another one I found in a deadmau5 pack. And I'll just play you this completely dry. And it's quite it's quite a knocky type of clap. It's like, you know, it's not got a lot to it really. It's just quite a quite dry, quite brittle sounding clap. So one of the things I did to really bring a bit of life into it, I'm a big user of the Sound Toys plugins, and I absolutely love for things like this where, you know, you're not talking about using reverb. It's a very different use of reverb. Anyone who's seen my other masterclasses will know that I tend to use reverb almost like some sort of like, you know, accelerating like riser rather than like a true reverb. But now, because I'm in this particular genre, I'm trying to put things in a more organic and real and physical kind of place. So starting off with using this little plate reverb from Sound Toys, which I absolutely love. And you'll just hear this lovely richness that comes to it now. And again, the settings are just literally a 1 second decay. All I'm trying to do is get that reverb to just die in between the clap so it doesn't start to clutter the mix up or clutter the arrangements up. Gives me more space to add more percussive options. Again, the mix is only at about sort of 25%, and the low cut is actually quite high on this because I'm just trying to get a little bit of top end through. And it's a subtle thing, but if I just... And you can just hear that little bit of space that it adds. The only other thing that I'm adding in here is just the channel EQ. And what that plate is doing is just rounding off that really brittle transient. It's just softening it a little bit and giving it a little bit of space to expand into. So that's the clap. But again, it's got that kind of organic thing to it as well, where it sounds like hand claps. It's not like an 808 clap or anything synthetic at all. So from there, again, there is some electronic elements in there, like this sort of more noise-based hat. Which again, just as you can see by the thumbnail of the EQ here, if I just bring that up, it's just, again, a slight rounding, just to round all the bottom end off. And also as well, stop it from becoming too brittle, just rolling off from around about 11.5K. So there's those elements. And again, sort of going through the rest of these elements now, I've got a couple of loops that I've found here in one of my favorite plugins ever, like Spectrasonic stuff, you'll see this all over this track, where I use this plugin Stylus RMX for things like interesting perk loops and like tambourines and shakers and stuff like that. I mean, this plugin is so old, it really should be in like the Rijksmuseum or somewhere like that, you know, like on display with the box. But it's just the reason why I'm still using it today is because there's still very few plugins like it, in terms of it will just play loops at your project tempo automatically without you needing to do anything. So I've got a couple of loops here which I've bounced down into audio, which is this tambourine loop. And what I would do to this tambourine loop here is I would just add in a little high pass. And actually, maybe just roll some of that. See, round about there, around 10, 11K. You can just hear some of that, like, real tinniness comes out of that sound, and it just becomes a little more soft and a little bit more interesting. From there, this is a technique that I've used quite a lot, where anything that's on, say, for example, an 8th or a 16th note with, like, really, quite long envelopes, I will use a kickstart on this for sidechain compression, essentially, or side chaining. And you can hear round about there, about 75%. It just seems to add this kind of like a bit of a groove. Yeah. So it's a really easy way of adding that to audio files. Then the other one I've got here is something I've just rolled a little bit of bottom end off. And what that's doing is just giving me like sub kicks. But if you listen to it individually, there's almost like little elements of like little, hip hop kick drums underneath that and that kind of thing, which is quite interesting. And it's got that kind of grainy, quite dusty sort of texture. I play out with the kick. It's just nicely moving. And again, I might kickstart that slightly just to make it clear the kick a little bit. Just picked a tighter envelope there just to make sure we still get the impact from those sort of sub kicks. So again, it's building a picture up now. And then if we look at, like, if we go back to the sort of the top here, I mean, there's a few different shaker layers. Yeah, question. Yes, sorry, it is. Yeah, it's also from that. So there's two of them. One of the things that I love about the, if I go back into Stylus for a second, this is what I love about it, right? If I just play that, you know, and I put host sync on, what you'll hear, if I just unmute that, that's both of them playing together. And you can actually layer up to 8 loops in one instance of Stylus and have them shoot out to individual like bus tracks if you wanted to. But I find it a much easier way. Once I've got the loops where I want them, I just individually bounce them in place. And again, that's one of the things that I really love about Logic is that you've got this true bounce in place function where, say, for example, you know, if I was to just show you that for a second, if I've got this tambourine in here, and if I was to just solo that tambourine, what you can then do is you can highlight that region, Control B on the keyboard, and essentially you could be at, like, you know, bar 242. And you could literally select it, hit bounce in place, hit OK. That'll just drop that now into a brand new audio channel exactly where, underneath where the region that you've selected is. It's incredibly useful. So again, you've got the freezing possibility in Ableton, but you know, again, having a true bounce in place like that's a beautiful thing for your workflow. So yeah, they're both from Stylus. And I'm just going to take the host sync off there. In fact, I can just turn that off now because I've got the loops. So yeah, there's various different shakers. Now, the funny thing is, we're starting to touch on another part of the conversation that we're going to have, where a lot of the shakers, I mean, not this particular track, but a lot of the shakers that I've been doing in some tracks recently, a lot of people have been asking me, like, your shakers sound, like, great. Like, what pack did you get your shakers from? And it's like, this. This €3 egg shaker I bought online from Amazon. And literally, if you've got, like, a decent microphone, play along to your own track. Now, I've been doing that, and it seems like the silliest thing. Like, or even just get a bag of sugar and just, you know, throw it all over the floor. But, you know, just little things like this, it tends to just add more to the track. It just gives you a bit more texture. And also, as well, you can then very easily think, well, hang on, well, I can just do that. But what if I do? And then you can experiment with different tones. And it's like, well, I can get probably an entire sample pack's worth, an entire month of spliced subscription for just shaker loops out of an egg shaker that I found in a music shop. So think about the next stage of where we're going, where another thing that we're going to go to in a minute is I've been leveraging this in a few productions at the moment, and it's been quite cool. This thing, yeah? Like, anyone ever seen the second Karate Kid movie? The older people in the audience are all laughing. So basically, this is like a little drum that I picked up when I was on holiday in Marrakesh in Morocco about 10 years ago. And recently, I just found it in a box, and I was like, aha. Cool. So I'll just record that in, and we'll do that in a moment, because I've got my Zoom recorder here. I'll literally just record this onto my Zoom. We'll transfer it into Logic, and we'll actually use it as a fill. And you'll be amazed at what you can get out of that. Very, very cool. So on top of that, you've got these shaker layers, like little loops that I've found. And they're all working together to just build these nice layers of, like, you know, organic, natural sound. And to talk about natural sound a bit further, I've added some acoustic drums into this as well. Just some nice acoustic, like, ride taps and little, you know, ghost notes from, like, snares, that kind of thing. And how I'm doing that in MIDI is through Studio Drummer. So I use Studio Drummer for this type of thing. And they've got in the grooves section, like these just amazing amounts of like preset patterns, which you can then, using this target icon here at the top right, you can basically, if I was to just drop this in, you can drag and drop the MIDI in. So what that originally looked like was this, and then you can play this. And there's fills and stuff in there as well, which we could potentially use in the production. But what I'm predominantly using it for are these lovely little ride taps and, you know, just that extra, rather than using like a big 909 ride like you would do in a techno production. You know, using something with a bit more lightness and a bit more, you know, and again, adding in with everything else. Now, this is a sample I've found in a pack on, a lot of people have been talking about how they use Splice quite a lot. Splice is amazing. In fact, I'll be honest with you, I'm actually doing a sample pack for Splice right now. And that's going to be out soon, so you'll hear more about that in due course. But I actually also love, there's another company that do something very, very similar, which is called Noiz, Noiiz. It's a British company. These guys, Noiz.com. So very similar thing, monthly subscription. They used to be called a company called Samplephonics that make incredible, they were some of my favorite sample packs. Very unusual, very different, very textural stuff. And what you get, which I don't think is working because of the internet connection in here, but what you get is a plugin. And what's great about Noiz is what you can see from the bottom here is that when you select the samples, it's essentially a web browser into the store. And then you can play the loop. But what it will do is that it will sync the loop in real time to your tempo of your DAW session. And you can even change the pitch to make sure that it's in key with the rest of your track. And then at the end, when you're happy with it, you can then just drag it and drop it into an audio channel in your DAW. It's a phenomenal, for me, it's a game-changing piece of kit. So even though I have like a huge sample library personally myself, it's become amazing recently for me to think, you know what, I just need that like little sort of, you know, Turkish style, you know, interesting, plucky sort of guitar type sound that, you know, and I really want to have in this type of production. And I can just type in various search parameters, find the one that really works for me, and then drag it and drop it in, which is exactly what I've done here with this one from this Noiz pack. And it's from a longer loop, which you'll hear now if I play that. Like, that's literally the loop. But what I've done here is that I've taken it, and then if I just open the inspector up here, what you'll see is that I've transposed all of the samples down by 7 semitones. So then found the loop of that works really well, tightly in the track, and then we get this. And then adding on a little bit of kickstart there around the kick. And again, just play that with the kick on its own. So then moving on into the more musical elements, we've got this what's called a Saz tremolo, which is like a kind of a, again, a Middle Eastern style guitar. I'm using Omnisphere for this. And Omnisphere is like the king of these types of sounds, especially Omnisphere 2. I mean, I've got Omnisphere 2 on my main machine back home. I use Omnisphere 1 when I'm on the road. And yeah, this thing is incredible for these types of sounds. It's got this unlimited kind of library of different sound sources. So all this literally is me just playing a line in 2 notes. Because if you just play that from the beginning, and then obviously that kind of underpins the whole thing and gives it this, it's emotional, but it's also, it's almost like substituting what like a synth harp would do in a more sort of, upfront electronic kind of techno record. So there's that, and then the reverb that you can hear is quite an interesting one because I'm using different reverbs. Normally I would be using things like, the stock Ableton reverb or something like a Valhalla vintage verb or Valhalla shimmer or any of these more slightly what I would call electronic sounding reverbs that are great for that kind of like, building and rising of tension. But again, because I'm in a different ballpark here, I'm actually looking to try and create something with a little more texture and a bit more realism. So where I go to for this, I'm also a massive Eventide fan. Love their more sort of, again, their more electronic reverbs, like the Black Hole is one of my favorite reverbs. But I also love this. This is called the T-Verb. Now, the reason why it's called the T-Verb is because it's named after Tony Visconti. Now, Tony Visconti was David Bowie's main producer for the vast majority of his career. And this plugin, T-Verb, it's actually a convolution reverb, which means there's been measurements taken of a real physical space. And the space just happens to be the hall in Berlin where Bowie recorded the vocal for Heroes. And there's a fascinating production technique which explains this plugin, where you can see here there's 3 microphones, 2 at the back, 1 at the front. And what would happen is you would have these mics set up and they would be gated into each other. So what that means is if you listen to the Bowie vocal for Heroes, he starts off very quiet and it's very dry and it's very close and very intimate. But then as he raises his vocal level, he hits the thresholds of the other mics in the room, which then open up and then capture the reverb of this hall. It's a very, very clever production technique that was done a long, long time ago. And I'm employing it here because I love the sound of this room. It's very, very natural, very organic, and just has a lovely sound to it, which, again, is lending itself to these very organic pieces of material. And then running other things through it here, like another Omnisphere, and I've got another sort of more melodic sound here. This is like the main riff of the track. Just play that on its own. And then all that is, you can see all the velocities are at like 1, because I'm just trying to get this very sort of like bell, like very soft tone. And again, it's actually another Saz style thing. It's actually, believe it or not, it's like an E-bowed banjo sound, which just works as like a melodic part really nicely. And if I wanted to add a bit more complexity to that, I'll add another bus in. Or in fact, no, I don't need to add another bus in. I just need to route it to the delay that I've already got. So one of my favorite delays of all time, the H delay from Waves, which is a phenomenal delay. You can hear that starting to really like add complexity. And then that's where you start getting that more banjo-style texture. And then that can be automated through the track in increasingly subtle ways to just change the tonality and keep things grooving, keep things interesting. So there's that. And then, obviously, there's bass in here as well. And it's a Monarch from Reactor 6, which is my go-to bass. Now, I'll be honest with you, like Monarch for me can compete with most hardware where bass is concerned. It's a phenomenal piece of kit. So, in fact, what I'd be doing in a more techno production is like the cut-offs would be going all over the place. There'd be like, you know, white noise underneath all of that. And, you know, there'd be lots of automation going on. In this track, I'm just going to just play it like that, nice and flat, and then it's going to be about where it arrives in the arrangement that gives the impact rather than the flashing lights and the fireworks of an automation. So there's that in terms of bass, and then the other one is this more stabby type of sound. And again, this just has a bit of H delay in there as well. And one of my favorite synths of the last few years by Yuhi, Repro 1. And again, once I start raising the cutoff up, it doesn't really suit the genre because it's almost like a little bit too aggressive. Because we want to get the emotion through the musicality and the music composition rather than, you know, the tricks that you can pull with a synthesizer. And the Repro 1, if you don't know anything about it, is a very, very good emulation of a Pro 1, which means it's monophonic. It's not really great for like chords or anything like that, but it will do incredible stabs, incredible basses, really great for arpeggios as well, just great across the board. So I'm using that as my sort of main sort of glue, if you will, between the emotion of the chord progression of the sub bass and something a bit more rhythmical, which then connects it to the more you know, guitar-led stuff like the sazzes and things like that as well. And then another sort of shaping that I'm doing to kind of give it more subtlety is I'm using a lot of strings. If I just turn those up a bit. And they're orchestral strings, but you can hear that there's maybe a slightly different tone to them. They're not quite big, soaring, like Hollywood-style strings. They're a lot more muted, but they're no less emotional. But they've got a really interesting tone and texture. Again, it's Kontakt. I'm using the Symphony Essentials string ensemble, and this is actually the violins 1. But what we've got here on the bottom left corner is various articulations. So if I was to, you know, play those, you can get the, you know, more Hollywood-style, dramatic sort of, you know, orchestral strings, tremolos, etc., trills for the more dramatic moments. But I really love it when I use the harmonics because it gives me this very, is a genre called like neoclassical, which is what people like Nils Frahm, Olafur Arnold, people like that, Johan Johansson, were very, very well known for. These Scandinavian composers and German composers who were, you know, playing with electronics and things like this. And again, it's a very interesting color. And again, I'm not playing it at full dynamics either. So if I was to play this, you can actually hear very, very light here, not very bold. But if I was to say, for example, compress this and then, or even turn the volume up just very quickly, they still come out, but the tone is different. There's not as much low end. Whereas You can hear as I increase the dynamics, the tone actually gets a little bit harsh. And it already has its own reverb on. But if I was to, again, just add a little bit of the T-verb to that, it will really give a little bit of space. Just hear that extra tail there. It doesn't need a hell of a lot. And I'll back that off a little bit because it was around there initially. The last element that I've added there is this. It's called a duduk, which is like kind of a Middle Eastern flute. Now, that's not a sample that I've found. That's actually something that I've played in, believe it or not. No, I'm not a secret Middle Eastern flute player, unfortunately. That'd be a good story, wouldn't it? So, no, what I've used here, I'm a big user. I'm back on my own computer at home. I'm a big user of the East-West plugins, and these plugins called Play are absolutely fantastic, where if I just try and load something from here, can I load anything from Hraach? No, it doesn't see anything. But basically, there's a great library here called Hraach, which is full of like interesting world music instruments from Africa, Asia, Middle East. And that duduk is actually something I've played in on a MIDI keyboard, which sounds incredibly lifelike. And it literally runs the whole thing from, duduks all the way through to like actually really great sounding didgeridoo, multi-sampled instruments. I've actually got a track in this genre that I'm finishing off at the moment, another one. I'm actually using that didgeridoo as a sub bass. And it sounds wicked. You just roll it down and it's like, sounds like a monarch. But it's a didgeridoo, essentially. So, yeah, I use the East-West stuff for these types of world music instruments, as well as the elements from Omnisphere as well. And then the final couple of things that I want to add is I've actually had some vocals recorded for this. And there's some amazing vocals that I've managed to get from a very, very talented friend of mine, who is an incredible vocalist called Madiha. And she does these amazing sort of like, she's a Pakistani woman with an incredible voice. So I've got these vocals to add in here as well, which I'll break down the vocal chain as well. Play that from there. Now, I'm going to turn all of this off and then play it again so you know that there has been no auto-tuning or anything. Like, this friend of mine can just rock and roll at the drop of a hat. She did all of this in one take. Crazy, absolutely crazy. So really, really excited to get these vocals into the track. And what you can see what I'm doing here, I'm just adding some parts here. And for mixdown, I normally like to reserve things like the virtual mix track for mixdown, but here I'm using it on a vocal chain. Why am I doing that? Because I'm looking to warm the vocal up and add a bit of presence with some EQ, both the Eosis Air EQ and also as well with the SSL. And this New York module here is just adding some saturation and again is acting effectively like a vocal like a preamp, as well as emulating running it through a Neve VR Legend desk, which is giving this warmth and depth to an already fantastic vocal. From there, in order to get that kind of like phasey double track, another Sound Toys plugin called Microshift. And that just, again, gives you this very minute delays. Gives it a slight subtle phase, but really, really works nicely. And on top of that, then, just to finally finish it off, another Waves plugin, the Crema Tape. So the Crema Tape I use as a delay. So if I was to add this little bit of delay in here, what you'll get is this really, really rich. And the delay is like around about an eighth note, so you're getting this like slapback type of delay. Very similar to like if you listen to, say, the vocal for Imagine by John Lennon, there's that kind of like slight delay that happens when he sings that kind of comes back at him almost instantly. It's that kind of effect that I'm looking for. And again, because of the analog character of the Crema Tape as well, because it has like wow and flutter and a little bit of like, you know, dust and a bit of distortion to it, that's very much what I'm looking for from this vocal. Yes?
Can I ask a question?
Of course you can.
Because of a lot of synths and a lot of the flutes going on, and also the vocals, how do you mix it like fluently in the track itself?
Yeah.
I have difficulties with mixing vocals into my tracks.
Yeah.
There's a lot of dynamics in the mid-high range.
Yeah, sure. It's a combination, I mean, for this particular track, it'll be a combination of clever arrangement where those flutes and that vocal probably won't exist at the same point in time. What I'm probably going to do is add that vocal to the breakdown and let that take the emotional elements up in that breakdown and give it an emotional payoff. But in terms of actually mixing it, this is where I take a bit of influence from the pop world, where the vocal is king. So the vocal has to sit. And one of the key things that I'll do is not only use things like this, the Waves vocal rider, in order to sit the vocal on top and almost have vocal compression without compression. It's basically like a manual fader ride. It's just turning the volume up and down. I could literally sit with the channel fader in Logic and do it myself if I wanted to, but this reacts far quicker than I can. I do things like that to the vocal so that sits on top of the track correctly, but then everything else has to sit around that vocal. So things like the flutes, what I would actually do from here, I would look to sidechain compress the vocals as a source and have the other elements like the duducks and the flutes and things like that, they would all sit down in an almost impossibly, you would never even notice that they've just very subtly, with very long attack and releases, they've just sat down all the other musical elements. And then as the vocal kind of comes out of the track for a second, for a breath, the other elements come back in and then can fill the gap. So it's about, because we use sidechaining mostly as like a creative effect in dance music production. This is where I put my audio engineer's hat on and then think about, right, okay, well, I'm going to use sidechaining in a way that you don't even know it's being sidechained.
It's a good tip. I think it's a good tip to sidechain it on, well, everyone knows how to sidechain it on a kick, but yeah, instead sidechain on the vocals so that the rest makes room for it.
Yeah, massively, yeah. And that's the thing, it's like, if you think about what we do in dance music, it's the same kind of rule but applied differently, isn't it? It's the kick is king. So we sidechain with the kick as the source because we're trying to make space for the kick. It's just that we managed to make a rhythmical and groovy and pumping kind of creative effect out of that, and we've repurposed that as a different use. Whereas here, this is a much more sort of, I would call, traditional use of sidechaining, which we've almost like kind of lost sight of a little bit in dance music because we've got so caught up in the really fun creative stuff, for sure. Cool. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to essentially record myself doing a couple of beats on this. And let me just make sure. Right, okay. Technology comes to thwart me a little bit. I'm going to just unprotect this card. That'll probably take another 5 minutes to load, but there you go. So yeah, what I'll do is I'll just, while that's loading, I'll take, say for example, one of the quieter sections of the vocal, and we'll look at the vocal rider, which is a fantastic plugin. So you can just see what's just happened there, where because we've got a threshold or a target at the top here, we can set this to the right level. And indeed, we can actually sidechain in, let's say, for example, the drum mix. Or we can sidechain in the other elements to use that as a target. So the vocal can be set to the right level. Because what this is going to do is when the vocal is below that target, as it is here, it will increase the volume. It will turn the fader up. So what happens is you get all of the detail, the subtle breath and shifts in the lips and things like that, that really, you know, make these vocals really intimate and quite interesting. But then in a louder section, what you'll get is this. And you can see there were sections there where it actually dropped and actually turned the vocal down. So in the louder sections, it can be programmed to sit the vocal down so those higher, more aggressive sound and more loud sections of the vocal don't overwhelm the backing track. And you can then pull back, and then obviously in the quieter sections, it will lift it up, and it levels the volume out. It's a brilliant, brilliant tool. It really is. It's well worth experimenting with if you've got any sort of vocal. In fact, I put this when I mix down. I actually put this on even like, you know, little vocal samples that people use, because it does tend to lift them up quite dramatically. So the vocals are going to go into here, and again, as you can see, it's a very big departure stylistically from what I'm usually producing in terms of like house, techno, progressive, that kind of thing. And in fact, actually, there's one other thing to talk about drums-wise. And a lot of these guys, like, especially like the likes of Hraach and Bedouin and stuff, they use a lot of like organic kind of drum fills. And me being a massive geek can recognize them from a mile off because I know exactly where they've got them from. And here, I'm using the Kontakt library, which I've been using for a number of years, because I also do a lot of work in film scoring as well. I write film trailers and, you know, stuff for documentaries and corporate work and stuff as well. So there's this library called Damage, which has these amazing, as it's called here, epic organic banks of loops. So if I was to just play the purple note here, you'll hear it. So you can use these as like a fill, essentially. And you can, you know, change various different aspects. You've actually got the individual notes here. And you can play them across your MIDI keyboard if you want. So then from here, I've actually got the same kind of option from Studio Drummer, where I can take MIDI to host here, drag the target in, and then that is literally the trigger of the region. So all I have to do now is, I mean, if I was to play that with a kick drum, I've probably just come up with a new track there. Let me just find the kick. There you go. Tribal house, anyone? So we can actually then strip some of these notes out. So if I just turn the MIDI arm off there. So we'll take like all of those and I'll just Control and M and mute them. And then they could actually all be muted, and then you can actually use that as like a drum fill. Kind of comes in a little bit weird, so I might just take a couple of notes off there just to... And then add a little bit of that to the T-verb. because I've got the ability now to play that across the keyboard, if I was to just put that back on, I could then pepper them across the track, which, you know, I'll probably do in the hotel tonight. I've got nothing better to do with my life. So yeah, so I can add those guys in as well. I'll probably put them in at the end of, like, say, for example, an 8-bar section, like that. And then if we were to just go out of there, and then I'll just pop that into the drum group, you'll hear that with the drums overall. So yeah, you can strip those loops out. You've got the single hits, and yeah, you can be used quite dramatically in breakdowns and stuff like that as well. So yeah, I think I've definitely gone on for long enough, haven't I? Yeah, Kevin's like, get off. Anyone got any final questions? I mean, I feel like I brought this along for decoration. Now I've run out of time. Anyway, in fact, fuck it, I'll do it tomorrow morning, whatever. Anyone? Have I bored you all to tears? I have, haven't I? No. Excellent. All right, guys, if there's no questions, I will leave it there. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.